Welcome back, everyone. Happy New Year. Alongside me for this one are Adam Crafton, Man United writer Laurie Whitwell, and our football correspondent David Ornstein. Great to see you all. Laurie, I'm going to come to you first, if I may. People might see the INEOS investment as meaning cash for the transfer kitty, but it's not quite as simple as that for United, is it?
No, I mean, they are still awaiting Premier League ratification, which we're told can take 6 to 8 weeks. And even in that instance, if they could put their own money in, it wouldn't necessarily adjust United's sort of wriggle room on the financial fair play, the profit and sustainability rules that they are very tight on, which they keep talking about as being big factors on what they can do in the January transfer window. But yeah, I mean, INEOS have committed, it's in writing with the SEC filing to the New York Stock Exchange to putting in $300 million. First $200 million of that will be done when the transaction is officially completed via the Premier League, and then the final $100 million by the end of the year. So that's and originally that is actually intended to go on the infrastructure. So Old Trafford, I mean, how much that will stretch to actually cover the kind of work that is needed at the stadium, I don't know. But it can also, according to the documents, be used for sort of regular business actions, which you'd assume would be transfer dealings.
And I guess the other question they're leading off that is the influence. It's the influence of Sir Jim Ratcliffe and Dave Brailsford. How much will they have of that until the deal is ratified? There's a danger, I guess, it could be a bit of a limbo period.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic at the moment because, as I've said, they're waiting for the Premier League ratification. And until that moment, then, the INEOS deal isn't official. So, Sir Dave Brailsford and Sir Jim Ratcliffe haven't got their hands on, they haven't got their keys to the door, I suppose, at the exact moment, but they are nevertheless on the ground. Sir Dave Brailsford was there at Carrington on New Year's Eve, the day after the Nottingham Forest defeat. Sir Jim Ratcliffe has been at Carrington and Old Trafford and will continue to be for meetings and kind of, I guess, getting to know you. I think that's the kind of stage they're at. It's described as a kind of a looking and listening and learning phase of the investment. They're not going to come in, from what we're understanding, and change things straight away. They want to sort of observe how things are done. And actually they can't. They're not, allowed as such to do so straight away because they do have to wait for this ratification. Obviously, in the documents, it says that they have to be consulted on all transfer plans from now on. And they were actually informed in writing of what those plans would be into the January transfer window. So all of these kind of stories that we're going to talk about, the Jadon Sancho thing, that's already been sort of set out in the transfer plans to INEOS. But as it stands, they aren't, from what we're told, going to come in and make big decisions straight away.
Which I guess, let me rephrase that because I'm going to do that. So that's great. Thanks, Laurie. It's interesting, David, because I guess that would suggest that United's January transfer window will kind of look how it would have looked anyway, regardless of the ongoing switch with INEOS.
Yeah, and it kind of has to, Michael, because INEOS haven't been ratified yet. And so they can have influence over proceedings, but they don't have power of execution. That was always expected to be the case in this 6 to 8 week process post the agreement being signed under the owners and directors test sort of restrictions. Maybe it will be a bit shorter. There have been some suggestions of 4 to 6 weeks. Let's see. And so the word at United was always business as usual, and they're having to work within the financial fair play, PSR parameters, which was gearing them towards possibly 1 or 2 loans, very little room to manoeuvre. And maybe that even suits INEOS, Sir Dave Brailsford and Sir Jim Ratcliffe, as they focus on getting in fully, which looks like it will be slightly post-window, and then target the summer as a real recruitment focus of their attention. And that might displease some United fans who want them to do a load of business in this winter market. But it doesn't seem to be realistic unless they can shift some bodies out in the form of Sancho, which we'll come on to speak about, a Martial, a Varane, for example. And that may give them a little bit more room to manoeuvre. And I suspect United's current football setup and recruitment department would have some ideas in place. They've definitely been having conversations behind the scenes as to what they might be able to do if that happens. And that should have been laid out in the plan we now know was relayed to INEOS. Like Laurie says, if that plan's going to change, there has to be an approval from INEOS. And now that they're on the ground at Carrington, it's probably quite easy to get that approval. But I think the summer is the big sort of start, really, from a transfery perspective. And if INEOS are going to bring somebody in as, say, a director of football and a head of recruitment, two positions that have been reported for weeks now, then it might take some time to get these people in. And therefore, it would be much better for them to start in the summer anyway and not make decisions now with people who might not be in place further down the line. So I think a bit of patience is going to be required around the transfer market.
They probably won't have any choice but make some decisions during the January transfer window, of course. And that probably does make it a good point to talk about Jadon Sancho. At the time of recording, Borussia Dortmund are in talks to take him back on loan, which may have come as a bit of a surprise to a few people. David, you broke the story. Where are we at with it, and what do you expect?
Yeah, the reports started emerging from Germany, and we managed to corroborate them and put a story out yesterday. Obviously, there's background to this because he played and did so well at Borussia Dortmund before signing for Man United for £73 million in 2021. There was some sort of dialogue last summer after the kind of flare-up with Erik ten Hag, maybe even before, I'm not sure, Laurie probably knows better. But at that point, the messages that I was getting from around Borussia Dortmund in particular was that it's not something that really interests them going back down that road financially and also footballing. But weeks have passed since, and it seems that some form of discussion has always been maintained to the point now where there are negotiations between the clubs, and it appears to be moving relatively rapidly around a loan deal until the end of the season. I think it would be in everybody's best interests, in their minds, to get this sorted. Bayern Munich have a training camp in Spain that I think they would like him to be a part of. Manchester United want him to get back playing as soon as possible because they've got a massive asset on their hands who's under contract for at least a couple more years, and the situation had become untenable. They either needed to reintegrate him, sell him, or get him out on loan to rebuild the value that's been lost. And the player as well presumably wants to get a move on with all of this. But there will be some manoeuvring around the numbers. They'll need to get it right on the loan fee and the salary coverage. But it wouldn't surprise us in the coming hours or days that we see some kind of resolution to this.
Adam, whether or not terms can be agreed, the Sancho signing just hasn't worked, has it?
I'll just start again.
Is that right?
Look, I think people will have their own views on it, right? Some people will blame Jadon Sancho. Other people will look at Manchester United over the past decade and see a club where very, very few players have thrived, no matter how much has been spent on them, whether it's on transfer fees or wages. You can talk about far more established players even than Jadon Sancho who have really struggled when they've gone there. You know, you can go back to Alexis Sanchez, Angel Di Maria, Radamel Falcao. I mean, the list is just endless over a really long period of time. I think with Sancho, there's been this increasingly bizarre standoff, right, between the manager and the player since the start of the season. You know, started in a press conference, carried on Twitter, carried on in more press conferences, and then he's just kind of disappeared from the first team, and therefore United have had a major asset that they've spent huge money on and continue to have a huge liability on in terms of wages that they owe, just sat there. And their position has been to back their manager, which feels like an increasingly fraught position given the results that United have had, given the amount of goals that United score, given the difficulties that United have had with players like Antony and Rashford this season. But it isn't a situation that looks like it's going to be resolved between Ten Hag and Sancho. And at the moment, it looks like the only chance you will see of Jadon Sancho playing for Manchester United again is if the manager changes.
I remember there being so much hype around Sancho's arrival. It was really exciting, and especially for a lot of fans of, say, Premier League football who hadn't maybe seen him in Germany as well, Laurie. Can you pinpoint why that hasn't worked out for him, particularly at United? I mean, United carry some of that blame. You're on mute. You're on mute, Laurie.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he certainly came into an environment where there was a bit of instability, where you had Cristiano Ronaldo signed sort of without the planning to go into it. It was kind of an opportunistic signing, and that, I think, totally changed what Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was trying to do, and then it kind of continued under Ralf Rangnick. So he's not really had a stable environment in which to thrive. You know, whereas at Dortmund he had a clear set of playing rules, and he was able to really harness that and get in positions that he could really be effective in. That hasn't really happened at United. I think also he does have to take his own fair share, because you know, he's had opportunities to play, and sometimes he just hasn't looked committed to the task. That being said, as Adam's touched on, you know, speaking to different people, and different people have views on whether Ten Hag was right to say anything publicly about Sancho's training, whether he felt that actually got to one point where he needed to shock him a little bit and try and jolt him into performing for him and doing what he was asking of him. Clearly, Sancho went the other way and suggested that there was players that were getting away with things that he wasn't getting away with, and it was, you know, a scapegoat, he called him himself. So, and I do think clearly Ten Hag's methods, you know, are difficult for some players to deal with, and so that's probably why it's interesting if Sancho does complete this loan to Borussia Dortmund, and as David touched on, the kind of finances will be really fascinating to know, because, you know, it seemed like Dortmund didn't have the capacity to buy or sign rather on loan a player like Sancho because of his wages. If they go and kind of complete this, it'd be interesting to know how much Manchester United contribute to that. But ultimately, it's a player that then they'd, you know, jettison because of the manager. So that kind of says to me that they're not going to do anything on Ten Hag, you know, at least until the end of the season, because why would you get rid of a player that could maybe work for a different manager? He's the reason why he's not in the team. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, because clearly this was something that they'd set out to do, I guess, you know, from the time that he posted that tweet, and it was clear that he was never going to play under Ten Hag again. And, you know, they looked at Saudi Arabia before the summer window closed over there. That was not something that he wanted to entertain. Clearly, the Dortmund thing is more appealing to him because he's had success there before. But it does. So maybe it was always planned that this would happen in January, and that kind of supersedes anything to do with the manager more immediately. But it's still, you know, I think they change their mind on that. You know, they could keep him and think, actually, well, we'll look at the Erik Ten Hag situation in a different light. But so yeah, I think that it's a really fascinating start to the INEOS era, even though they're not perhaps the ones that are, you know, pulling the levers on this. They are clearly a part of the decision-making process.
And David, given how in demand Jadon has been in the past, will Dortmund get a free run at this, or could someone else come in for him and fancy seeing if they can, you know, enjoy Sancho's abilities for at least 6 months?
Yeah, it's remarkable how times change, because at one point he was arguably the hottest property in world football, certainly in that attacking department, and he was gettable from Borussia Dortmund. And that's why a number of clubs had been looking at him. But actually, when the transfer happened, which was a year after Manchester United initially tried to make it happen, they did appear to have a clear run at it, which has led some people to suggest that United overpaid, as they have for a number of other players. But there is no doubt the regard in which he was held, and he was in the England setup at the time, meant that he was among the foremost young attackers in European and world football. Right now, in the circumstances, I'm sure there would have been an element of interest from clubs in the Premier League who perhaps fancied the chance of trying to reinvigorate him and bring him back to a level that is there, surely. And abroad, of course, there would have no doubt been some other options as the window went on. And many people would have put this down to Erik Ten Hag and the environment and backed themselves to make a success of him. But as it's come to it at this point in time, they feel like the only sort of credible option in terms of the desire of all parties, including Sancho himself. And the news, the timing of it maybe came as a bit of a surprise to me, because in the sort of days and weeks leading up to it, I wasn't hearing of any major movement because of the size of the salary and what's gone before. And you're signing a player for the final 6 months of the season who hasn't been playing for several months leading into this period, and is not up to sort of match speed and fitness. And if and when this deal goes through, it will be interesting to see what condition Sancho is in. He's been training alone at Manchester United with, I think, an academy coach, using academy facilities, being bought lunch in boxes from the main building. It's not ideal. It's actually quite remarkable that this has been taking place for a player and a club at this level. And so, it will be a really good test of whether he can re-find the heights that he's hit before. And then Manchester United will potentially have a decision on their hands. Do they reintegrate him in the summer? Do they look to loan him out again? Do they look to sell him? Lots of unanswered questions. And let's see, Laurie touched upon the makeup of this deal from a financial point of view, but who knows what will happen in terms of options or not? Is it going to be a straight loan? Could there be ways in which it could turn into something else? It's a really fascinating situation.
Yeah, just picking up on one point that David made there, actually, in that there was some suggestions that United might even cancel Sancho's contract because it got so bad with him, training alone and calling in sick occasionally, and not necessarily having any kind of resolution or future at United, it seemed. But United were never going to cancel his contract because the implications for the financial regulations, it takes a big hit to kind of, obviously pay a player off. That's a lump sum, so to speak. And then also you lose their transfer value that you can put in the accounts through amortization. So the idea with this loan is that Sancho can go away, reinvigorate himself, show to people that he is worth the kind of money that United paid originally for him. I don't know if United would ever get that kind of fee again if they were to sell him in the summer. But the idea is at least that he can have some value back. And listen, if the situation changes in the summer, then maybe he does come back to United ultimately.
We've already discussed Jim Ratcliffe's intentions in terms of the money he's going to invest, but as we've also kind of already suggested, there are going to be surely some significant structural and personnel changes at Old Trafford if he and INEOS wants to make those changes. Adam, where do you see how United are at the moment and where they may focus their attentions on in terms of personnel and structure?
It's a kind of like, where do you start point of view. I mean, at the moment they don't have a full-time chief executive. They don't have a head of recruitment, as far as I can see. They have a football director, but not a sporting director. Is that the same job? We're not quite sure. Is someone going to come in above John Murtagh, who's the football director, or is someone going to go alongside him, or is he just going to leave? I think all of these questions feel quite open at this moment in time. They have a lot of scouts. How much they listen to all of those scouts, we aren't quite sure. They have a head coach who, if you're being kind to Erik ten Hag, he has kind of had to operate over the last few months in particular without a CEO, without a head of recruitment, without a sporting director. And, he was a tracksuit coach at Ajax, and everything else was done for him by people like Edwin van der Sar, who was CEO, and Mark Overmars, obviously, who was the sporting director and did a lot of the recruitment side of it. And yeah, it's for sure, it's true that, his judgment on signings, I think, has been pretty poor, you'd have to say, over the past 2 years. But, a club that has a proper structure in place wouldn't be allowing him to make those decisions in the first place. It would be, offering so many targets that he wouldn't have to be, reverting to either players he knows or people who are perhaps, who have been represented by the agent that he works with, that he's leaned on as well for advice at times. So I think the priority for United is to fill those really key positions, CEO, sporting director, head of recruitment, and then maybe, then you look at the head coach, and that might be what gives Ten Hag a bit more time, because it certainly won't be based on performances or results, both of which have been pretty shocking all season long. But it might be that kind of structural mess really above him that buys him that little bit more time. And, he will also, something he's really started to hammer home over the last few weeks is we're going to get a lot of players back from injury in the next few weeks or so. Man United only have one Premier League game now in January. They've got Tottenham at home. And apart from that, they don't play until February, apart from the FA Cup. So they will Erik ten Hag will be hoping that he's allowed that time to get players back like Casemiro and Lisandro Martinez, and I'm sure there's others there that Rasmus Højlund, who obviously missed the Forest game, and he'll start to have a team that looks like his own. And there won't really be a hiding place after that, because United are out of Europe now. They're not in the Carabao Cup. They've got a lot of time on the training pitch. So if the players still aren't responding when Ten Hag has all that time with them, then I think it'll be very, very difficult for him to keep his job. But I think for now, those are the factors that buy him a little bit of time.
There's another part of this that says that Ten Hag has a decision to make. In the summer, I think he'll have a year to go on his contract, plus an option for United to extend. And if things are stable at that point and he remains in position, then presumably these coming weeks and months will be used for him to do a bit of due diligence as well. Does he want to continue? Are the parameters going to be right for him? There have been some reports in the last 24 hours or so suggesting that he wants to keep this veto he has over transfers. That has been the case since he came into the club under the regime of John Murtough as football director, Darren Fletcher, technical director, more recently Matt Hargreaves as transfer negotiator, Andy O'Boyle as deputy football director. But it will obviously be a new setup, and will Sir Dave Brailsford, Jim Ratcliffe and others who may come into the club be willing to give him that sort of power, or will it change? And if it changes, will he be happy with that? So yeah, of course, there's more power in the hands of the new ownership setup at Manchester United. But if Ten Hag picks up a bit of a head of steam, then will he have a decision to make as well?
It's really fascinating, this whole landscape, because there's so many different motivations and kind of, influences behind what's been going on the pitch. And I think one thing that Adam touched on, all the uncertainty above, I do think has an impact on the players themselves in terms of what their sort of thinking is, in terms of, Erik ten Hag listening to his instructions and carrying them through to the fullest. And also the people above him, if they're thinking about their own job security, are they really going to be channeling all their energy into making the environment the best possible one for Erik ten Hag and the players, and looking at all these different players that might be out there? I just think it's a natural situation where, you kind of energy is diverted a little bit. And clearly Erik ten Hag has had a big say on transfers, but that's not to say that he has then also signed the checks off. Antony for €100 million ultimately is probably the big one, where he's clearly pushed for that kind of signing. But it came at the end of a window after United lost 2 matches, and kind of he wanted a centre forward from the very beginning, and that never came. And so Antony was kind of the attacker that was the one that was most viable to get. So how much responsibility did you give him for the price tag, and how much responsibility did you give the structure for actually not being able to, as Adam says, provide real viable alternatives that can actually boost what a manager's looking for? I think it is a really interesting dynamic, and that's what you expect Sir Dave Brailsford and Sir Jim Ratcliffe to investigate and ask questions about. You think to the kind of people that they've associated with before, and they say that Brailsford in particular is, drills down into the minutiae of structures and tries to find out why people do certain things, and that's the expectation that he will do that at Manchester United. I do think that it is an interesting structure that has been created. John Murtough being the football director, we've written a piece recently about how he came to power and the issues, the turbulence that he's had along the way, and then the current structure as well. I mean, Adam touched on a head of recruitment. That's kind of like a standard job for all clubs in the Premier League, but United have a director of scouting instead, which is kind of, it's evolved throughout the last few years of it being the case, where you've wondered. I thought Steve Brown, for example, it was the head of recruitment. It turns out that he's director of scouting. So his job is primarily to organise the scouts. It's a big job, as Adam said. There's a lot of scouts, 140 full-time and part-time at the last count, although they are trimming that number. And but he doesn't make decisions on players, which is kind of like, you want a head of recruitment to have that authority to say, this I know what I'm talking about here. This is a player that will do a job for Manchester United if we want to win titles. That hasn't been the case at United. So in that sort of area, Ten Hag has then pushed himself and gone, well, I think I might know. And, obviously he's got a couple, right? I'd say Martinez was a success last season. He's been injured this season, but others, he hasn't. So that's kind of what's going to happen. You can't have a Sir Alex Ferguson situation where he was basically the sporting director and manager in the same situation. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer also did have a veto of transfers, but I think Ten Hag's got much more authority than Solskjaer had in terms of exercising that. But that being said, he still, for me, he hasn't had the support of a real elite recruitment scouting department that I would say perhaps Jurgen Klopp and Pep Guardiola have had at Liverpool and Man City.
It's also, I mean, just what you've just said there, Laurie, 140 scouts across full-time and part-time. And who was the last player Manchester United signed that looks like a find by the scouts? Because so many of them
Ahmad,
like
potentially.
Ahmad, yeah, okay. Garnacho, perhaps at the youth scouting level.
Yeah,
but
Alejandro Garnacho, yeah.
But in terms of first-team players, I mean, the club just hasn't worked like that. So why have they had 140 scouts on the payroll? Like, I mean, these guys have been wasting their time, haven't they?
Some of them probably think that way because you hear a lot of stories of recommendations being made passed into the system, and it doesn't really go anywhere. It basically waits for the situation to be pressurised enough for United to have to make a signing, or a manager to push for a signing, so that stuff happens. I can't point to a signing aside from the ones that you said there, where the kind of academy. I mean, Alejandro Garnacho, 250 grand. It was at the end of his contract at Atletico Madrid. It was, it turns out to be an inspired signing because his value now is much bigger. But it's not one where you're thinking, a surer thing, like a Julian Alvarez at River Plate to Man City in that January transfer window where Ralph Rangnick was in charge and United declined to make any signings because they had an interim and they didn't want to, foist a player on a manager that was coming in. Well, I don't know. Would Ten Hag have said no to Julian Alvarez, as his first signing as Manchester United manager? I don't know. I think that's where you need, as you've touched on, a real strong sporting director to have a clear idea as to what would work and have that confidence to execute that, rather than the situation that United have got at the moment. And yeah, I mean, the scouts, they have reshuffled them. I think we might do something on this in the coming days and weeks. I think they have realised that they have a system there that isn't providing clear thought process, and they need to be able to trust people. They need to know that certain people have got a track record of actually, they're not going to get everything right, but it feels like it doesn't really go anywhere. All this kind of data and information, it kind of is just in this system, and it needs a real spark, a real sort of leader to harness it.
Yeah, it feels like we're getting onto a key part of the conversation here because Sir Dave Brailsford has a really good track record in sport, high performance, cycling, dabble into football with Nice, Lausanne, maybe even the America's Cup sailing, but INEOS haven't operated at this level as a group, and most of the individuals involved too. And therefore, I think Jean-Claude Blanc, who is going to be taking one of the seats on the football board, would be critical because he has experience in helping run Juventus and Paris Saint-Germain, and has a really interesting backstory that the guys have written about on The Athletic. There's a good piece I'd recommend you go and read. He's very highly rated. People I've spoken to in the industry who know him and have seen him operate in what is often a bit of a catty industry, pretty much universally speak highly of him and the way in which he operates and think this is a coup for Manchester United. But then the sporting director or director of football, if there is to be a new one. And it seems by the day reports are growing around the possibility of Dan Ashworth coming over from Newcastle. I don't know of any sort of contact or movement or negotiations at this point, but certainly he's somebody that is known well personally by Sir Dave Brailsford and is said to be admired by INEOS and possibly their first choice. I'm sure other names will be in the frame as well. And there is a notion that as well as a sporting director appointment, they would like to bring in a head of recruitment, who again you would assume would be of real high repute and experience to fill the gaps where INEOS maybe lack for no fault of their own, but also to make United this sort of industry leading operator or competitive and building towards the levels that, as Laurie mentions, Liverpool, Manchester City and others are already at.
Well, let's have a quick little bit of fun then, because it does sound like United haven't got much money to play with come January. And maybe there'll be some business they want to do. Maybe there are some targets. We know Sergio Reguilon's loan spell from Spurs has already been cut short as well. So they're clearly getting to business in that way. Donny van der Beek has also joined Eintracht Frankfurt on loan for the rest of the season. And there's an option to buy, I think, in that one as well. So, Laurie, where do they need to target and what should they do? Give us some good old fashioned names.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I always enjoy just plucking a few names out. And to be fair, sometimes in January, that's what it feels like United do. I mean, last year, who could have predicted Wout Weghorst, which again was something that kind of came about through chance a little bit. You know, they thought they were going to have a little bit of money to spend and Cody Gakpo was the choice, and then actually they didn't, and Wout Weghorst was available at that particular stage. So, and Ten Hag, you know, he knew him and he made that call. So yeah, again, always keep your eyes peeled on what United could do. And I think, again, it's a striker that if they could do something, they would. I mean, David's touched on one loan, maybe two. That's kind of the consistent theme that we're hearing from United. And I do, sometimes they say this and then they go and do something crazy, but I do kind of believe them on this one. So, I mean, there's a few names that they've, I suppose, looked at. It's weird to sort of say they've scouted because you don't really need to scout a player like Thomas Muller. You know, you just know what you're going to get. But they're looking at players, I think, that are established, that they could bring in on a short-term basis, that would be open to coming to Old Trafford, but also that they know roughly what they're going to get from them. You know, and so to that theme, also Eric Maxim Choupo-Moting, the other Bayern Munich forward that's kind of been displaced by Harry Kane, the striker that Ten Hag really kind of wanted as his number one choice last summer. It's kind of funny how the dominoes fall, I suppose. Timo Werner is someone that they've checked on at RB Leipzig. So they're not names that would necessarily thrill United fans, and, you know, quite the opposite. They might get, you know, sort of a few eye rolls, but I suppose at this stage they're looking at just trying to enhance that forward line, because I think it changes, you know, each sort of game week, obviously, but I think they are only scored. They're basically the third. So I'll start again. It changes each game week, obviously, but I think they're currently the third worst scorers in the Premier League right now. You know, Sheffield United are the team that are kind of clearly below them in that chart, and they're bottom of the table. So it's kind of remarkable that United have actually this many points from the amount of goals that they've scored, because, you know, Rasmus Højlund, I think, he's done really well in certain ways, but he's not really had the service, and maybe in terms of his movement, he hasn't been able to get those chances that you'd hope for. He scored a really good winner against Aston Villa for his first Premier League goal the other week, but clearly you'd want more from your strikers at Manchester United. So United are looking at that kind of area. And then also, I mean, listen, if they do end up selling a player, that they've put Sancho out on loan, as you say, Donny van der Beek, they've terminated the Reguilon thing. So they're all kind of deals that perhaps might help them get a bit more money in terms of the finances for wages, but not necessarily an actual transfer fee. If they did sell somebody, it's tough to say. I mean, Rafael Varane, possibly, just because he's actually out of contract at the end of this season as it stands. United do have an option to trigger, although I don't know the exact parameters of that. But yeah, if they do get some money in, then Sekou Girassi is someone that they've looked at, you know, the Stuttgart striker that's on a bit of a hot streak at the moment. He's got a €17.5 million release clause, so I think that's why the appeal is there. You know, it's a straightforward deal that they'd want to do, but he's 27. He's not really showed this kind of scoring form previously, so again, I think it would be a little bit of a punt to bring him in now, but that's the kind of area that they're looking at. You know, maybe there's a couple of other positions that they'd like to strengthen, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't get the sense that they are advanced with anything at the moment.
I mean, Adam, it would strike me as bad news for any elite football clubs wanting to make a lot of money, because Manchester United are pretty good at overpaying for players. You know, they pay well over what some initial valuations might be, and I guess some of the payback for that for United is that they probably isn't much room, even if they did have the money to be able to spend it, because of FFP and profit and sustainability rules.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, it's really shambolic that United are even close to the FFP limit, given that their revenues are, you know, amongst the very highest in European football. Their commercial income is incredibly resilient, you know, given the lack of success that we've seen on the pitch. And it is because of the excess of the past couple of years that United are in this position where it's actually now no longer really an issue of funds, but an issue of paying the price of basically wasting money on previous signings. or overpaying for those signings if you don't think those signings were necessarily a mistake. So that's where they are. That's the reality in January, that once again they are kind of left scratching around for loans or budget moves, none of which will turn the dial, on their season. I think they're far more reliant on players potentially coming back from injury or players suddenly hitting form than whatever they're going to do this month in the window. I mean, the only thing I'd say about, we've spoken a lot about the sporting director, head of recruitment. That stuff kind of needs to happen pretty soon. Clubs will be already, the smart clubs will already know who they want to be signing in the summer, and they'll be getting ahead on that. And I know Manchester United, sort of the existing regime, if you like, are, they're kind of working on targets in the summer, but are they likely to be the same targets as whoever comes in as sporting director and head of recruitment and whatever? So there is a risk there, in terms of that alignment over what Manchester United even want to do in the summer, because the best run clubs will already be getting ahead on that, and United can't afford another 6 months of this kind of stasis that you've had for the past 12 months because of the strategic review, that the club has kind of been unable to move forwards because nobody's really known what's going on.
Even though the opening week of INEOS being on the ground here has been described as sort of softly meet and greet and listen and learn.
What are they learning, David?
Well, you tell me. We need another inside story from Laurie to establish that. But the consensus inside Man United is that there will be changes, whether they like it or not. And few conversations I've had suggest, you'll start to hear more on potential sporting director and other possible appointments in sort of early to mid-January. So to Adam's point, I'm sure they will want to get on with it. And there are some reports doing the rounds that INEOS are sort of blocking any permanent transfers in the month of January. That they don't want to do it, not only maybe because of the financial situation dictating that they can't, but as Laurie points out, that there could be sales and outgoings that make it possible. But if INEOS are just saying, no, it's all going to be a summer question, then they need to get their staff in place so that they can attack that window. There may be notice periods, gardening leaves and things like that delay the process. So in their view, I'm sure it's the sooner the better.
Just one thing. I mean, we've spoken a lot about players in. I mean, it's still amazing how bad they are at players out, over the last few years. I mean, they sell so badly. And they went on this little jaunt to Saudi Arabia before the turn of the year. John Murtagh, Matt Hargreaves. It was too late. They'd missed the boat. Every other club had been out there in the summer. I mean, we saw Todd Bowley. He literally just went out there. I mean, he gets a lot of criticism, right? But he went out there and he sold 3 or 4 players. United got there too late. I mean, this was unlucky, but that was unlucky. I think it was less unlucky in the summer, where you had lots of clubs sort of building relationships. Some were more fortunate. You had Steven Gerrard go in at Liverpool, so all of a sudden Al Ettifaq wanted lots of Liverpool players and things like that. So there was misfortune involved, but it is this pattern of just United get round to things 6 months after they need to, and that means they're behind the times.
And I do wonder how much of that is the personnel that they've got in place. I certainly think there's blame to go around there, but also the ownership of the Glazers. I think that has a big impact in terms of having to relay stuff to them back in Florida, Joel Glazer primarily, and also just, as we've seen with the strategic review, just the amount of time they take on making decisions and kind of drilling down into details and kind of wanting to have a little bit of moment to think about things and then come back. So it'd be interesting to see. Obviously, INEOS have only got 25%. They've got the sporting control. Does that really make them the go-to guys on all these kind of decisions? And does that give a speed to it? Because if you've got Ratcliffe and Brailsford actually on the ground in Manchester, that's brilliant for United, surely, because you've got owners and kind of influential figures there who can make those kind of quick calls. They can sense the mood of the atmosphere at Carrington. And I suppose that's one thing to be said for the sort of John Murtagh regime, is that it did become much more Manchester-centric than it had done under Ed Woodward and Matt Judge, who were based down in London making decisions in their Mayfair office.
There is a little bit of that at many clubs. So, I don't know, Liverpool and FSG, although they've had Mike Gordon as the sort of link, which Manchester United haven't mastered anywhere near as well as Liverpool did. Arsenal have the Cronkies. There was a bit of a distance there, but they've got Tim Lewis, who came in, who's kind of UK-based, but on behalf of the Cronkies, he helped them with their takeover and now is a critical figure in the operation. And Edu, as sporting director there, has a direct line too, I suspect. And Chelsea, for all the criticism that they get, Adam's right on, they've been pretty clinical on the sales. They've had the conversations, made the trips, formed the relationships, and got the business done. And many of their fans are criticising the idea that they might listen to offers for Conor Gallagher in this window. But if they come in, he's got 18 months left on his contract. Some tough calls need to be made, and it's not impossible to see if the right numbers come in that they sell again, and it really does help their financial fair play situation. Manchester United had some big calls to make themselves on the likes of Scott McTominay and Harry Maguire, and as with pretty much every situation other than maybe Dan James a few years ago now, they decided to stick rather than twist. And of course the players and the buying or loaning clubs have involvement in this as well. But selling is described as being one of the most important, if not the most important skill within the transfer market and the financial fair play, now called PSR calculation. Liverpool have done it well. Manchester City have done it increasingly well. And they're really the model of that sort of slick operation from top to bottom and powers of execution on the ground in Manchester. The contrast couldn't be more sharp. And Manchester United have a huge amount of work to do to bridge that gap. And
I think at this point, we should probably let them get on with it because time is ticking. Thank you so much to Adam, to David and to Laurie for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Please remember, you can rate and review this podcast if you're enjoying it. And there's also an offer on at The Athletic, $2 or £2 a month for 12 months. So go check that out. Until next time, thank you all for listening.
If you like this video, click subscribe for more content like this. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season to bring you the inside track to the biggest stories in football. If you'd like to listen to the full episodes for free, search The Athletic Football Podcast wherever you get your podcasts from.